Hi everyone, Sam here. In today's snippet, we're going to talk about Service Endpoints, the relatively new feature that allows us to protect some of our PaaS resources better when we're accessing them through a virtual network. Okay, first thing, what are Service Endpoints? Service Endpoints allow you to restrict access to certain PaaS services by locking them down to access either from a specific Azure VNet or from your on-premise network. You might see written places that Service Endpoints allow you to join a PaaS resource to your VNet, and that's not technically correct and is worth understanding. So when we look at adding Service Endpoints to our resources, what we're doing effectively is locking those resources down to only receive traffic from our virtual network. Those resources aren't directly joined to our network. They are still sat out in the PaaS service area. They're a multi-tenant service, so it's not actually really possible for them to join our VNet. So they still sit out in the PaaS environment and are just locked down via the magic of routing in Azure to only allow traffic from your virtual network. So that's important to understand. Those services aren't joining your VNet. They are just being made only accessible from your virtual network. So here we've got a simple diagram from the documentation that shows how this works with a storage account, which is the same example we're going to use here. So you've got your virtual machine running inside your virtual network. You enable Service Endpoints to talk to a storage account, and now only traffic from your virtual network is allowed to access that storage account. Any traffic from the internet is denied access to that storage account. It's also important to understand that any traffic you're now sending to that storage account from your virtual network is going to use the private IPs. So in this case, 10.1.1.4 from this VM is what's going to access the storage account. So you have to bear that in mind if you're going to restrict access further using SAS tokens that are limited to IPs, or if we're going to talk about SQL using the SQL firewall, all that traffic's going to go over the private IP. Also on the diagram here, access is now also being allowed from the on-premise network. So it's not just Azure VNets that can be allowed access. By using IP ranges, you can actually add access from on-premise resources as well. Service endpoints are only supported on certain services, and you can see them listed here in the documentation. So we're primarily talking about storage, databases, be they SQL, Postgres or MySQL, Cosmos, Key Vault, Service Bus and Event Hubs, and a preview of Azure Data Lake Store Gen 1, not Gen 2. Okay, so now we know what service endpoints are. How do we enable them? We've got a resource group here. We've got virtual network and a machine running in there, and a storage account that we want to restrict access to just to come from this virtual network. So at the moment, the storage account is open to anyone, and you can get to it from the internet, and there's no protection on there at all. So to enable service endpoints, the first thing we have to do is actually turn on service endpoints on the virtual network. So that's before we do anything on the storage account to restrict access. We have to tell Azure that we want to use service endpoints on our network and for a specific service. So if you click on the virtual network, you've got this service endpoints option here. If we click on that and we click add, we now get to pick which service we want to enable service endpoints for and which subnet. And the key thing to bear in mind here is once we turn that on, as the warning says, any traffic that's trying to reach those resources is going to use the private IP address. And that's all traffic. So if we turn on service endpoints for storage, any traffic you're sending that tries to get to storage will go over that private IP address. You click the drop down, you can see we've got all those different services that we mentioned before. I'm going to turn on Microsoft Storage, and then I'm going to pick my subnet. I've only got one subnet, so we'll pick that one and click add. And that will turn on service endpoints on the virtual network. At this point, the storage account is still configured to allow anyone access. We're just turning them on our virtual network. So we can see that that's now enabled for Microsoft Storage on one subnet. So now we've got the virtual network configured, we need to go and configure the storage account. So if we click on the storage account, and what you're looking for here is firewalls and virtual networks. So if we click on that, and at the moment you can see this allows access from all networks. We want to click selected networks, and then we want to go and click add existing virtual network. and we want to add this machine demo virtual network. And we're going to allow, again, access from the default subnet. So you can configure which subnets are allowed access on both ends, and obviously that needs to match for access to actually be allowed. So we'll click that to add our virtual network. You can see down here we've also got the option to add IP ranges. So the virtual network is fine if your network's in Azure, but if you want to do the scenario we saw in the diagram where you're coming from your corporate network, or if you just want to get access from your home PC or similar, you can add specific IP addresses or CIDR ranges in here to allow those non-Azure networks access as well. We've also got some exceptions that we can allow here to allow specific other things through. So things like trusted Azure services. And if you want to see what those trusted services are, if you click on that link, it'll take you to the documentation, and you can see that's allowing things like Azure Backup, Site Recovery, Event Grid, Event Hubs, and so on. These services that often rely on storage accounts to store some of their data. And bear in mind these exceptions are going to be service specific. So these are trusted services for storage. You might find that trusted services for SQL are different. Similarly, we can turn on allowing read access for logging and metrics from anywhere if we want to. So we can be specific about whether we want to allow those exceptions or not. So I go ahead and click save. And now my storage account is set up to only allow access from my virtual network. So just to test this and prove it's working, I've got a copy of Azure Storage Explorer here, which is running from my desktop machine. And this is the storage account we just configured. So if we expand that and try and expand blob storage, I get an error saying I'm not authorized to perform this operation. If, however, we run Storage Explorer from this machine that's in the virtual network, and we open up the same storage account, you can see that I've got access to the containers that exist on that storage account. It's because I'm on the virtual network, which has got the storage endpoint configured. So just take a look at a different setup so we can look at how this is done on SQL Server. The first thing to note on SQL Server that you're configuring this at the server level, not the database level. So we go and click on our SQL Server, and again we've got this firewalls and virtual networks option. And you can see here that so SQL Server has had a firewall on it for quite some time, so you've still got the existing firewall options available here where you can just allow client IP addresses and so on. But we can also now come in and add our virtual network that we configured. So we can now, but we can also come in and configure virtual network access through Service Endpoints. So we can come in and click Add Existing Virtual Network like we did before, and we'll pick our subscription and the network we configured earlier. And you'll notice here that we are getting a warning saying that the subnet doesn't have Service Endpoints enabled for SQL. So if you remember earlier, we just turned that on for storage and not SQL. Now we can click the Enable button here, and that will turn on Service Endpoints for SQL for us. But as the warning says, it can take up to 15 minutes to actually do that. So that can cause an issue if you turn on the firewall at SQL and that hasn't taken effect, because the SQL server is only going to allow traffic from that virtual network. But if the endpoint hasn't enabled yet, the traffic's not going to be routing the right way from the private IP and won't be allowed in. Therefore, you could have a problem connecting to the SQL server. So ideally, it's best off to enable that at the virtual network first, and then come in and enable it on the server itself. We'll go ahead and click Enable so that can do that for us, because this isn't production work. And we can then click OK to actually turn on the firewall at the SQL server. And now we can see that's now enabled for this SQL server, and so I'll only be able to access it through these virtual networks. And that's really all there is to Service Endpoints. Turning it on the other services like Key Vault, Service Bus, etc., it's pretty much the same process. So if you want to start locking down your resources to your virtual network or to your on-premise environments, go ahead and take a look at Service Endpoints. Hopefully this was a useful video for you, and I'll see you next time on Azure Snippets.